Good morning subscribers, and in today's video I'm going to be focusing on figure 8 from the GCSE A593 paper. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's get to it. As ever, I have prepared in advance a number of potential questions for this particular paper as follows. Calculate the change in the price of copper from 2011 to 2015, and then the remaining questions primarily consider number 1, the decline in the demand for copper, which is discussed in this little section, and then secondly the decline in the economic activity and economic growth in the Chinese economy, which is featured in the bottom sort of 3/4 of this particular figure. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's crack on with a little bit of analysis here. So again, very important that you're able to just work out and calculate a simple and very straightforward percentage, ladies and gentlemen. And let me just show you that in this instance. So I'm just saying to you, make sure that you can calculate the percentage change from 10,100 and it's moving to 4,955. So how do we do that? Obviously we are taking 1 from t'other in order to get the difference. So we're doing 10,100 minus 4,955. Doing that calculation first. We're then putting it over the original number, which is of course 10,100, and we're timesing by 100 to give us a percentage. When you do that, ladies and gentlemen, you will find that that is a 50.9% reduction in the price of copper from 2011 to 2015. Now obviously, if you are reliant upon, as Zambia is heavily, indeed it says, does it not, it's the place where 80-something% of its revenues come from. If you're heavily reliant upon the price of copper, then this is disastrous for your economy. Okay, so let's get rid of that, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, where's Oliver when you need him to find out how to clear this thing? Let me just double check. I think it's that one, is it? Clear, yes. Okay. Moving into the rest of the questions, ladies and gentlemen. Using a demand and supply diagram, explain how the change in demand for the commodities identified will have affected their prices. So remember your 593, it's a synoptic paper, so it can be the micro analysis or the macro. So in this instance we will be considering the micro analysis. So it could be copper, it could be iron ore, it could be any of those commodities which are mentioned. And all we're thinking about, well, what would be happening in terms of demand, supply, and then the impact upon price and quantity. So let's just set ourselves a diagram up for that one, ladies and gentlemen. So we're looking at a micro-analysis style diagram here. So price and quantity on our axes, and supply of said commodity, demand for said commodity. Initial equilibrium, P1 and Q1. We are considering a reduction in demand. What will be happening? The demand curve will be shifting parallel to the left. So we'll be going D1 to D2, and consequently the price will be falling P1 to P2. And very important to note, it's the quantity demanded and supplied. So we're going from A to B, quantity demanded and supplied, moving toward the origin and therefore reducing. And so that would be our answer, ladies and gentlemen. Do make sure that you can explain and analyse these diagrams in full, as I have discussed before on previous videos. Okay. Explain why falling Chinese demand has negative multiplier effects on the global economy. Now it talks in your textbook, ladies and gentlemen, about the multiplier, and the general gist of the multiplier being that if you inject a certain amount of stimulus, for example, financial fiscal stimulus into an economy, due to the multiplier effect and spillover effects, you get a change in national income which is greater than the initial change in your expenditure. So for example, if the government pumps 10 million into the economy, let's say, for example, so we would say that that is the change in expenditure equal to 10 million. Well, your national income, Y, delta Y, your change in national income might increase by, let's say, 30 million. Now that, of course, is a multiplier of a value of 3. Because you've injected 10, but your national income grows by 30. But the key thing to remember here, and the point that we're really trying to draw out in this question, is that the multiplier also works in the opposite direction. So therefore, if you pull out 10 million from the economy, then your national income will contract potentially by 30 million. So you can have these negative multiplier effects. When we are looking at the Chinese economy, if we just consider that for one moment, and we'd be looking at more like an ADAS diagram here, so we'd have price level and real output. And we could keep this nice and simple with just a couple of simple AD and AS diagrams. So we could have AS and AD. This is our initial equilibrium, P1 and Y1. Remember, it's Y, not Q, when we're talking macro diagrams. So, if we were to consider this as being the global aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and we then think about, well, what is happening if the Chinese economy slows? Now, you'll have heard before in the past, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Now, the same can be said of the United States. And it's ironic, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm making this video on the very day that President Trump is meeting President Xi Jinping to discuss all sorts of things. So these two great superpowers meeting together. But as Chinese growth slows, then the demand, particularly for all of the natural resources which they've been hoovering up in vast quantities, will start to fall. And so it mentions, for example, in your pre-release, it talks about Australia. Australia, as you well know, is very rich in natural resource. Well, a lot of that has been sold to the Chinese. If demand in China starts to slow, then that obviously has negative impacts on all of its supply chain. Australia being one great example of that. And so if we consider this the global ADAS, what will happen, of course, and I'm sure you know this already, will be that AD will shift to the left. And so global growth may begin to contract, may start to move in this direction, and we move toward the origin. And of course then there are all of the repercussions that surround that. People working, for example, in the mining industry in Australia will find that they're no longer in demand, therefore people may lose their jobs and become unemployed. What happens then? Their incomes will be cut severely. What happens then? The amount of spending in their local economy contracts. What happens then? The local shops don't have as much business, therefore they don't need as many part-time employees, and so this whole negative cycle builds and continues. And so this is the whole notion, ladies and gentlemen, of the negative multiplier. So we could say and express quite simply that A, equilibrium point A, may shift to equilibrium point B via this negative multiplier process. So that's really what I'm just trying to get at in that question. Next question. Demand and supply diagram. Explain the impact on the value of the Zambian kwacha of falling demand for its copper and rising unemployment in its mining company. That is mentioned in the pre-release material. So I want to look at this from two aspects, ladies and gentlemen, if you will allow me. So let me just consider this one. First of all, we just sort our colours out here. So we're drawing an exchange rates diagram. So we're going to have quantity of, you can, certainly in the A level now, they really want you to say quantity of currency. I'm really not happy about that, but anyway, that's and price of currency. So keep yourselves right, do what the exam board are looking for, and that's what we want. So we would have the supply of the kwacha and the demand for the kwacha. Supply and demand for the kwacha. Kwacha, what a great name for a currency, ladies and gentlemen. Kwacha. Okay, what will be happening? Two things. First of all, we're talking about the fall in the demand for copper. What does Zambia do with its copper? Primarily exports it. So we are talking about a reduction in the demand for copper. What will that do to the demand curve? It will shift it to the left. And so the demand for the kwacha goes from D1 over to D2, and equilibrium moves from point A to point B. Okie dokie. Now, what we're saying here that the price has fallen, but what do we really mean, ladies and gentlemen? We mean that the value of the kwacha will be depreciating. That's a depreciation against other currencies. Now, why will that be bad for a country like Zambia? Well, one of the things that they need to be able to do is to bring in capital equipment, for example, from abroad, machinery, all sorts of other sort of manufactured goods in order to help the country develop, because of course it's a developing nation. Well, if the currency depreciates, as you know, export prices move in that direction. So there's a couple of things happening there. That will further suppress the price of the copper export, so that the Zambian government get less money for all of their exports. That then makes it a reduction in their revenue, so therefore they've got less revenue to put into, for example, health, education, and all of these factors which help to boost their Human Development Index, which I've talked about with my class previously. And of course it also makes their imports more expensive, because as your currency depreciates, then it costs you more to bring goods in. So that would be on the sort of the demand side. However, I've also just thrown in here rising unemployment in its mining company, and would that have any impact on the demand and or supply of the kwacha? And I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that would also have an impact on the supply side, because, let's think about this, if outsiders looking in on the Zambian economy see that things are taking a little bit of a turn for the worst, then they'll think to themselves, we need to get our money out of Zambia. And so they will then start to sell the Zambian kwacha. As you know, when there's a big sale of the Zambian kwacha, that will shift the supply curve to the right, to S2 kwacha. And so your final equilibrium position might be actually way down here, so you get an even further reduction and depreciation in the value of the kwacha. Final equilibrium resting at point C. So don't forget to consider both sides of this argument. And that, ladies and gentlemen, just by way of a little info for you, when you get that massive sale of the currency, that is known as capital flight. Capital shoots out of the country. And we've had, for example, Greece have had that problem, if you recall, in the last 12 months. Crisis of confidence, and then people just abandon the currency and they ditch it and sell it off and buy another currency in its place. Okie dokie. Explain how the change in the value of the kwacha will impact the price and demand for its imports and exports. We've already considered that. This is a video, ladies and gentlemen. If you search on my channel actually if you go to the Geekonomics Meets playlist, you'll find I've done an interview there with a colleague of mine called Mr. D. Bourne. And Mr. D. Bourne lived in Zambia for a number of years. And so we've done a little interview there together. So worth a watch, just for a little bit of background info on the Zambian economy. In economics, what is the Dutch disease? What's the Dutch disease? Okay. Demand and supply analysis can be used here again, ladies and gentlemen. You will not be asked to explain what the Dutch disease is in the exam, but it's just worth knowing from a personal interest point of view. So again, we'd be looking here at the price of the currency and the quantity of the currency. So Q of C, I'm going to write for short, don't you abbreviate it in your exam. Supply of the kwacha and the demand for the kwacha. So the Dutch disease, as you can tell, obviously associated with a problem in the Netherlands. But the Dutch disease can be applied to any country which is very rich in natural resource. What happens in the good times? When the sun is shining, ladies and gentlemen, what happens? Well, the demand for that commodity shoots up. What does that do to the demand for the currency? Well, that also shoots up. So the demand for the currency will be shifting to the right, D1 to D2. So we're moving from equilibrium A to equilibrium B. P1, P2. Now, what's happening all the time as this happens to the value of the currency? It is moving upwards. It is appreciating, as we would say. What are the problems associated with this? Well, it makes the price of your exports more and more expensive. Now, that's all very well when you've got a very strong global economy. However, when the economy takes a little bit of a turn for the worst and you've got still a very strong exchange rate, then that makes it very difficult to sell your key export, which in the case of Zambia is copper. And then the other problem is, during the good times, you've just ploughed all your money into the copper mining industry. Money, 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 just keeps going into the copper industry. And you haven't diversified into other areas. And so when the demand for this suddenly switches off, you've got nothing to fall back upon. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we're talking about when we reference Dutch disease. Not something you'll be asked about in the exam, but you know, maybe you could throw it in somewhere. And then lastly, whoops-a-daisy, analyse the impact falling copper. Analyse the, spelling there, must change that. Analyse the impact of falling copper prices for the Zambian economy. I think you should be doing this, ladies and gentlemen, by way of an ADAS diagram. I think would be the most appropriate way to consider this. Because, ladies and gents, let us not forget that AD is C to the I to the G to the X minus M. Now, if the demand for copper, just flick back to the question, falling copper prices, why are we getting falling copper prices? Because of falling demand. What is copper to the Zambians? It's their export. So exports will be falling. As a consequence of that, maybe some of the local workforce will be laid off and lose their jobs. So consumption will start to fall. As a consequence of the reduction in the sales of exports, the government gets less tax revenue. So maybe G will start to fall. As a consequence of that, the Zambian government can no longer bring in and import as many capital goods and machines as before. So we've talked about the reason for that earlier in this video. So I may start to fall. And of course I has a double whammy effect because I impacts AS as well. So as a consequence of all of these things, ladies and gentlemen, we could make a very, remember, price level, real output. As a consequence of all of these things, we could make a very good case for saying that the following may happen. So if you start here, point A, what might be happening? AD shifting left via the negative multiplier. You may wish to bring that in. So we go AD1 to AD2, potentially landing there, potentially. However, if machines are wearing out in the Zambian economy and they can't afford to bring in any others to replace them, new replacement machinery, then AS may be shifting inwards as well. And so AS may be, let's say, might move to here, might shift in to LRAS2. And so we actually end up at this point here, point B, at P2, having moved from P1. We're going from Y1 to Y2. Contraction of the economy, unemployment, all of these issues. So ladies and gentlemen, that is it. And I hope that is fairly comprehensively covered this most recent figure. So I will see you shortly with the next A593 figure. Bye for now.